Good afternoon from Tokyo. This is the live session for the Japan FinTech Observer. And it's the second time that we do this online as a follow-up to the report that comes out weekly on Sunday or Monday mornings. That's at least what we're aiming for. And we have 42 editions out. There's almost 8,500 subscribers now. So it felt worth that we can try to have a conversation around it. And I promise I won't read off the newsletter. That wouldn't be much fun. Actually, I'd like to take a deeper dive into a few of the topics. This is the live session for Tuesday, January 16th, and it covers the report for the week ending Sunday, January 14th. The big three topics that we picked out for this conversation, I would like to take a slightly deeper dive, are the following. One is AEON, which is a large retailer here in Japan, gained approval for its Islamic digital banking license in Malaysia. And when we put the report out, we actually had a few people asking, AEON and the bank? And yes, AEON actually has a pretty impressive financial services business that runs alongside its normal retail, and it's actually a listed subsidiary on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. You can actually buy shares in AEON Financial should you decide to do so. That's the first topic, and it's quite a comprehensive deep dive into that because of the uniqueness of actually creating a digital bank somewhere outside of Japan, and secondly, that AEON Financial runs on a fiscal year that ends in February, I think. And that means that for the quarter ending November 30th, we actually had reporting out last week. So we'll take a few slides out of that to talk about what AEON does and how they do it. The second point is AsiaNext, which is a joint venture between SBI Holdings, or SBI Digital Asset Holdings specifically, and SIX, the Swiss exchange. In Singapore, they launched crypto derivatives trading. And that maybe went a bit under the radar screen after the Bitcoin ETF approval in the US, but I do think it's a significant milestone. And these two, together with the third one, really provide a pretty good past week for Japanese finance fintech operators abroad. Laser Digital is a subsidiary of Nomura, and they actually started being incorporated in Zurich and only made it fairly recently. That means around October of last year, they created a Japanese subsidiary. Three things to talk about in the banking, payments, and derivative space. There are a few more points that we have to round it out at the end. And again, if you have questions, please use the comment box on your platform. And if there are any, we'll address them either as we go along, or if they don't relate to the topics immediately, we'll try to address them afterwards. All right. So let's dive into the Malaysian Digital Bank. And we've stolen this slide here from a Quinlan and Associates report from last year that mapped out the overall digital banking landscape in Asia, which is quite a difficult thing to do because it's fairly dynamic, and we might have some opinions on banks that should be included but are not on this list, and vice versa. But it's a great effort, and we'll always appreciate the insights of Benjamin Quinlan and his team. Now, what is worth pointing out is that if you look at Singapore, Hong Kong, and now Malaysia, they issued specific digital banking licenses, and some of them come with specific requirements. In Singapore, for example, two of the licenses were for wholesale business, while the rest was for retail. And in Malaysia, it's also Islamic finance, Islamic digital banking business that the license is for. So in this overall landscape, given that we're talking about this from a slightly Japanese perspective, if you look at Indonesia, there's Genius, which is an SMBC subsidiary, and it's the same name as the new retail bank that they started in the US last year. So that is the name of the banking businesses it appears that SMBC has chosen for those that run outside of Japan. One could argue that Line should be somewhere on there. They certainly have a bank in Thailand, and I believe they also have a bank in Taiwan, actually. And SBI also has a few banking subsidiaries in Korea and also in Thailand, maybe. While you had over the last 2 years, 3 years now, these new digital banking licenses coming up in Hong Kong, Singapore, and now Malaysia, which awarded 2 licenses. The second was a consortium called Boost. In Japan, actually, you don't have a specific digital banking license. So we've had digital banks since 2000, 2001, when the first branchless banks came up. And so you apply for a banking license, and there's no requirement with the banking license that you actually need to open a physical branch. That's why kind of the early iterations of what is now PayPay Bank, I think, and then Rakuten Bank, kind of they are 20 years old. And when we say here there's Japan listed, keep in mind that the regulatory environment can be different across these jurisdictions, obviously. We've been following AEON for a little bit simply because we found it very interesting what they're doing in the context of the Japanese ecosystems. And while others might be talking about super apps or financial super apps, in Japan, it's really about building an ecosystem, gel it properly with a point system. Points typically can then also be used basically as a cash equivalent when you pay. In a way, you can understand them as e-money, although it's not quite regulated as such. And so AEON has obviously a very large retail consumer base that goes into their malls or into their supermarkets, not only in Japan, but also in many countries in Southeast Asia, where they've really been for a very long time. I think we're hitting about 30 years now since they've started the first operations outside Japan in Hong Kong. And they're trying to leverage that in very interesting ways. One here from last August is a collaboration they did with Funds, which is a fixed income crowdfunding platform. And they were essentially collecting 100 million Japanese yen to put them towards financing. And the interest rates on that were still minimal, but they were much better than you would get with your mega bank or regional bank. And in addition to that, they ran a lottery. So for a limited number of participants, they got a cash prize, quote unquote, in points. And this prize, if you are among the lucky ones to get it, was actually significantly more than the interest income that you would have generated on the maturity of that instrument. So you can play the probabilities, and so the expected value of that actually then was pretty good. And the way they played it was also very interesting. A little bit of gamification built into that, where 90% of the overall volume was done in a lottery, and people could subscribe to that, again, through the app. And the last 10% then was sold afterwards on a first come, first serve basis. But these 90% were actually 6 to 7 times oversubscribed. So it was a huge success. I haven't seen any coming out after that, but again, certainly an interesting model and well received by the client base. So they're innovative in that regard. When we look internationally, announcement from October where AEON was acquiring an equity stake in a postal financing company in Vietnam. And that was important for the reason that they've got a strong presence. They've got quite a few more. They've got even more supermarkets. And they've been providing under a license installment financing, whatever, paying for, let's say, the classic BNPL type thing, or how you would pay off a credit card, for example, in Japan as well. Having now a banking license allows them really to give loans to their customer base. And first of all, gives them a much broader product portfolio. And secondly, the margin on these loans are at least double of what these installment payments generated. So not only have they done this transaction in October, then in December they signed a strategic alliance with C-Bank, which is the entity that owns these telecommunications bank, and they're planning to do more together. Whether that ultimately leads to a full takeover or remains somewhere on a consolidated basis remains to be seen. But clearly, Vietnam and now also then Malaysia with a digital banking license are growth markets for AEON Financial. So as I said, they actually reported earnings last week, so it's worth taking a look at that. And clearly, there's splitting the strategy into domestic and global, which truly is Southeast Asia for the most part, or let's say Asia, including the likes of Hong Kong, etc. And on the domestic side, they want to focus on the payments business primarily. Not that that isn't competitive with all the different wallets and payment businesses that are out there, but that is ultimately the foundation. But as we will see around the payments business, they also have a wallet that gives access to further financial services. And global, it's really expanding into markets that have much higher growth. And right, in a way, you can have a debate around Malaysia. Also, Hong Kong and Singapore are all very much banked. Let's say the underbanked population is very limited. Malaysia also has 80% of the population has bank accounts. So you need to come up with a creative strategy to actually capture the market and achieve proper profitability. But we'll see a few things that happened already hand in hand with this earnings presentation to see how they streamlining the domestic business and then also expand further. Domestically, they announced that there is an entity called AEON Product Financing, or APF. That one they will spin off into Orico. It's Oriental Corporation, large credit card processor, and strong in the B2B business. Mizuho holds a large stake in that, around 47% or so. And so AEON will take a stake in that combined entity based on the terms that they have agreed. So they basically released the news together with their earnings last week, and the deal will close at the end of much. There's probably still some details to iron out as to the valuation, etc. And we'll see what percentage AEON Financial then ends up with at the end of this. Secondly is then really the payments business. And keep in mind that PayPay launched in Japan in 2019. So it took on about 2 years to react to this until they launched their own payment service in September 21. And by now they've got by now they're probably over 10 million customers on the payment app, which compares, whereas PayPay sits somewhere 50, 60 million, I think, at this point. But clearly it's a good vehicle to continue building customer affinity and keep people in the ecosystem. They've done a significant refresh of their wallet app here at the end of last year, and they've already experienced, they've done a data comparison 60 days before the release of the new app and 60 days after the new app. So they've reached sales volume on financial products, insurance, and account openings that are 2 to 4 times higher immediately after the new wallet was released. So it seems to be a worthwhile investment. And in a way, this becomes the financial super app for this specific ecosystem. So you can bank, you can pay, you can buy insurance. They bought or have a significant stake in Allianz Life Insurance here in Japan, which is AEON Allianz Life Insurance these days. And as we will see, I don't know if this was the next slide. Yes, the next slide. Actually, with the beginning of the new year, January 4th, they've launched an alliance with Monex, the securities broker, so that when you are in the AEON wallet, you can also open a securities account with Monex and you can trade. So again, that money stays in the ecosystem. Now, for those who followed the developments here in Japan, you would know that towards the end of last year, NTT Docomo had to plug a gap in their own ecosystem. And so they bought the control of Monex. They actually purchased slightly less than 50%, but they were granted the majority of the board seats. So effectively, they have control of the entity, and it becomes consolidated for NTT. They didn't have this offering, and at the same time, as far as securities broking is concerned, the big two, first of all, SBI Securities started it, and then Rakuten Securities followed up almost immediately. They started zero fee trading for Japanese domestic stocks. So it's a bit like Robinhood-like in November last year. And the way Monex sale, Oki Matsumoto, who used to be at some point the youngest Goldman Sachs partner before he started his Monex business, took the opportunity to divest himself of the classic brokerage business, at least in Japan. They still have a trade station business in the US. And some of the funds were actually used to buy a digital asset management company that has ETFs in Canada. So they have been pursuing for the last 2 or 3 years a strategy of turning themselves from a transaction, meaning brokerage business, to an advisory business, asset management business. And in a way, these two transactions are part of implementing the strategy. But now that Monex sits within a competing ecosystem, when you look at points, we've got D points in the Docomo space. The question is that actually still a good partner for Monex, or will they make any changes going forward? So we shall see. Here's Vietnam strategy. So you can see, and they've got 233 locations, 670,000 members, and now with the integration of the postal finance business, they can issue personal loans, credit cards, and it also have an insurance agency business. So the installment finance business is what they could do with the license that they had so far. So the purchase is kind of buying the banking business that is maybe not quite as digital as they would like, although there's quite a bit of investment that CBank had been made into this postal finance business over the last 2 or 3 years. But then the final point on that is, you think, why would AEON actually apply for a digital bank in Malaysia? And their idea is that the lessons learned in Malaysia with digital technologies and customer acquisition in the digital space, etc., ultimately can be leveraged into the group, and not only in Southeast Asia, but also ultimately back into Japan. So we shall see whether they take some of the build that they made in Malaysia and lift it back into Japan, for example. So it's very interesting. Again, if you're an investor, you can look into AEON Financial. It's separately listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. I don't think they've been on the bad list that came out yesterday. Moving on to the second point, when we're seeing AsiaNext started crypto derivatives trading. What is AsiaNext? AsiaNext is a joint venture between SBI Digital Asset Holdings and the SIX Digital Exchange in Switzerland. They basically have full licensing in Singapore now, with a capital market services license and a recognized market operator license to run all institutional crypto businesses. And that includes the cash products, derivatives products, also includes tokenized securities, digital securities, and tokenization of real world assets. It really sets them up nicely there to then also use what on the left hand side here, which is the tokenization platform from SBI Digital Markets, which is a joint venture together with CM Commercial Bank 10X, which is their innovation arm. So it's a bit harder to dissect all the strategy aspects of what SBI is doing, but so obviously there is the domestic component, both of which are here at the bottom. So there's the Osaka Digital Exchange, which they started and have broadened the ownership of towards the end of last year, before they went live with their tokenized security platform, which is called START. ODX had been operating as a PTS, so a private securities market, since the middle of 22. And while it's very hard to start off a new exchange with new products and limited market participants, traditional equities are something everybody understands. And they have actually, with their equities PTS, achieved record trading volumes in the last week, which is probably no surprise in a way if you followed the strong start that the Japanese market had into the new year, the first 6 trading days until last Friday. It's been a blasting start, and certainly the improvements that people expect still have to happen, but the markets anticipate that. So there continues to be strong interest into the Japanese markets. But the volumes here on ODX are minimal. We looked at it last week. At some point in the morning session, there was like one trade made for one issue of the two that are listed are two tokenized real estate products out there, and the trading volume then was 100,000 yen in the morning session. So clearly that will only grow. There will be more issuances, and there will be more issuers on the platform, as well as more market participants. Then on the bottom right is Progmod, which is the tokenization platform that had been spun out of MUFG Trust and Banking. They built it and they spun it out into its own entity, Progmod, as a company in October. SBI, through one of their entities, is a stakeholder in that, and it's essentially positioned as national infrastructure. That's how they'd like to see it. The other tokenization platforms here in Japan is Boostery, which comes out of Nomura, and then there is another one that Ginkgo, together with Libre, is working on, and might be even more. Internationally, then, though, so we've talked about then the domestic side, we talked about Singapore. The European angle to that, outside of the SIX relationship in Switzerland, is that SBI Digital Holdings also has taken a stake in Börse Stuttgart Digital. And the Stuttgart Börse is the largest retail exchange, let's call it, in Europe, because they're listing and trading a significant volume of warrants. And so they also then started a crypto business and a digital entity that hosts all of this. And SBI Digital Assets Holding has a stake in that. So lastly, on the top right corner is part of Project Guardian that the Monetary Authority of Singapore ran. And here's one of the work streams underneath that. SBI, together with UBS and DBS, demonstrated how to run a repo in the digital space. So that involves stablecoins, involves the digital bond that gets repoed out and brought back. And so you can look at the flows of that as well. So there's a variety of things that are happening under the SBI umbrella. And then maybe this is a bit more, it's not necessarily more retail type, but obviously they have a crypto exchange here in Japan as well, or two or three, because they acquired others as well, which they use to anchor different businesses underneath, right? They've been a long partner with Ripple and building a payments system and remittance services around Ripple with them. Recently, they announced a trade finance partnership with TradeFinex, which is the operator of this XDC network, and B2C2 is being an institutional broker-dealer liquidity provider that has been operating or as a subsidiary of SBI also quite for a while. So tons of things going on here in that space. If you take a look at the quarterly reports of SBI Holdings, it's about 150 dense pages. So you need to pick your battles if you want to go through that and be disciplined, looking just at one segment of what they're doing. Otherwise, you might get lost. I certainly do every time I look into that. So it requires quite some reading. So the last point of the three big announcements was Laser Digital. So Laser Digital is the digital asset business of Nomura. The announcement was that they create what they call Libre, which is a joint venture together with WebN. That's the Brevin Howard incubator, and it becomes an alternative assets token distribution platform that is built on the Polygon CDK. which made some of my friends very excited again. That, if I remember correctly, is supposed to launch in the first half of this year. So that is not yet live, and there isn't too much information behind it, but you can think of other businesses that do maybe something similar. ADX in Singapore is an entity that we're somewhat familiar with because we had their CEO on our podcast. And there are people who are doing something similar in Japan as well. And clearly, when you look at ODX, it's a tokenization of real world assets, of real estate that is being traded on that exchange. Maybe not the first one out of the gate, but this is going to be a long journey of establishing these infrastructures, and ultimately there will probably also be some consolidation of the players. But maybe the one thing that Laser Digital is more known for at this point is their digital asset custodian, which is Komainu, which is a joint venture together with Ledger and CoinShares. Of course, Nomura backed, and they've also got alliances in Japan to develop it and deploy it, for example. So there's been quite a lot going on. I would be remiss not to mention that Laser Digital got a capital markets license in Abu Dhabi, I think it was, in October last year. That seems to be, I wouldn't say that, maybe it's going to be the headquarters. Again, originally registered in Switzerland and Zurich, and the first really operational license in the Middle East. So we'll see how that evolves. But clearly, the people at Nomura are also bullish on this business, which is good to see. So these were the top 3 points that I wanted to cover. We have a few more smaller things that maybe were worth picking up from the report that we put out for the week ending January 14th. One is that last year there have been changes to the regulation that governs how dormant deposits at banks and other financial institutions are handled if they haven't been touched for 10 years. And previously, it was such that these were going to be used for public goods projects. And last year, there was a change that now they also can be invested in private companies. And the idea is that starting with the new fiscal year, April 24, that to start with somewhere between 500 million to 1 billion yen of these dormant deposits get funneled into startup financing. Interesting method of bringing the ecosystem up, but there you go. I think you've got, right, generally in many jurisdictions, you've got laws and regulation that determine what happens if you haven't logged into your account for a number of years. In the US, it, I think, typically falls to the state that the financial institution operates in or your account has been opened in, for example. And in Europe, it might vary by country. The second point, maybe some trends in the venture capital flows that we've seen over the last few editions of the Japan FinTech Observer. One is the Japanese startup market is still relatively small. It's growing and it's moving in the right direction, but it's actually maybe not in a position to absorb as much capital as there's being thrown at that startup ecosystem at the moment. Secondly, you've got tremendous growth rates, especially in Southeast Asia. Of course, you have a much smaller wallet size, but if you're one of the incumbents, you're positioning yourself for future growth, and that makes a lot of sense. So MUFG, who has been playing the Southeast Asia game for over a decade now. They've got banking subsidiaries like Krungsri in Thailand, for example, but they've also have launched individual funds. They've got an India fund, which is the Ganesha fund. They've got an Indonesia fund, it's the Garuda fund. And so they're making investments in these markets. And the second is kind of the counterbalance to that is that clearly the Japanese market has done tremendously well last year. If you look at it in domestic currency and the listed market, the stock market, if you look at it in domestic currency, it really trailed only the US and the NASDAQ. In dollar terms, obviously, it's not quite as brilliant, but it depends on what your bookkeeping currency is and your tax-paying currency in the end. But private capital is always trailing the public markets, right? And it happens in terms of valuations, but maybe in this case also in terms of the interest. And there is now much more interest also on the private investor side, venture capital, private equity in Japan. So the news last week was that Gree, which is a large game, they have a fairly established corporate venture capital business, and they're planning to raise a large second fund this year. But before they do, they seem to be trying to test the waters by reopening their first funds for foreign limited partners. So if you have an interest in putting some money into Japanese gaming startups, technology, etc., then it's an opportunity for you to try out as well how to operate with a certain GP, and in this case, Gree. So that might be interesting for you. Also, just again on the money that's flowing out of Japan, you have these government or semi-government organization like the Japan Investment Corporation, who have been equipped with quite a bit of cash to kickstart the startup ecosystem. But for once, I think, that's my personal opinion, again, there isn't that much on offer to actually deploy the capital. And secondly, then based on that, they're trying a play where they essentially investing as an LP with a foreign asset manager who ideally doesn't have a presence in Japan yet. And so the play is on twofold. One is if you have startups that ultimately target Japan as a market, they will come here, right? They will establish an office, they will hire people, they will grow in Japan. That's good for the economy. And secondly, also in a way, it's a subsidy for these venture capital firms to start up a Japanese office, right? If I give you $100 million to invest on a 2 and 20 basis, that alone on the annual fee gives you $2 million. That's a nice subsidy to start opening a Japan office for sure. So there's incentives that are being paid in a give and take. So watch out for that. I think it's interesting how these cross-border investments are flown. Goes in both directions. And FinTech is a bit boring maybe from a Japanese perspective, simply because clearly it was a bit late in the global development. But if you look at the startup world across like deep tech things, bioengineering, robotics, electronics, etc., things that are coming out of the universities is very interesting. And in the general startup space, we picked a venture capital investment today in the news that went into a robotics company. People waking up to the quality of the research also that comes out of the universities here, and there's more of this investment to come, especially because as part of the 5-year startup plan that the government has laid out, which we're like 15 to 18 months into it right now, there were also measures to make it easier for employees of if you're a doctoral researcher, postdoc researcher at the universities, to actually have a second job, start your own company, or to have license agreements around the IP that you generated as part of your research. So if you're talking about 100,000 new startups being generated over this period, a large part of that has to come from the universities. And on that side as well, the ETH in Zurich, which is Albert Einstein's university, they spun out 40 startups last year, which is, I think, a pretty impressive number. If you had every Japanese university going at that level, and obviously Todai a few more, then we would be in pretty good shape. So last point, which was announced in the newsletter, but has been going on for a while, is that the TSE for 9 months now, so really with the beginning of the 2023 fiscal year in April last year, started to push what looked like initially really companies that are on a price book ratio under 1, to establish measures to earn the cost of capital, which is always a good thing, and to improve the share price. So it's a bit of shareholder capitalism in there as well. And it simply came from the fact that the market overall at that point, if you looked at the TSE, the price to book ratio was under 1, if I recall correctly, while the US ended the year maybe at 3 or so. So the difference is quite significant. Any of these changes, even the slightest change in behavior to do away with further cross shareholdings, to incorporate listed subsidiaries, to issue more dividends, to buy back stocks, etc., was shit on, is a contributing factor to the Nikkei having done that well last year. But ultimately now the rubber hit the road, and the TSE had threatened for a long time that they would publish the names of the companies that actually have formalized the plan. And that day was yesterday. So on Monday, after the market closed, these lists came out, and you can view it on the TSE website if you're so inclined. It's interesting. If you play around with the data, you can actually download an Excel spreadsheet with the names there, and you can have an accompanying presentation that we also posted on the Tokyo FinTech LinkedIn, so you find it there as well. The strange thing about this, and this is, I don't know how to judge it, I simply say it doesn't make sense to me, is there are companies who have submitted such plans and companies who have not, and there's some who are considering it. And in the numbers that the TSE has published, they actually included these under consideration entities in the numbers that are in compliance, which is a bit strange, right? Because you have a measure that is there to create transparency in the market, and ultimately you're fudging the numbers to make them look higher than they really are. This is no longer about talking about doing something. This is about actually doing it. And if it's still under consideration, then there's nothing that's been published. It's a monthly list. Let's be honest with ourselves and use the lower number of those who've actually have come out publicly with a plan and said, this is what we're going to do, and that's a real number. So that's still relatively low for both the prime and the standard segments. It's much higher for the prime. On the standard segment, it's 11.5% would be my number. So that is the one that are truly committed. I think if you consider to include under consideration in the standard segment, you would end up with 18%, which is still significant progress with 3 months ago where it was around 4% or so, but still a long way to go. The prime numbers are much better. So going to continue seeing clearly foreign investors have been watching this, and the last year's market was largely driven by these low price book ratio stocks catching up because it was felt the pressure goes on to them. At the end of last year, the TSE made clear, however, that also for the higher price book ratio stocks, they expect these plans. And that might well then include measures maybe to bring down the price book ratio by a bit by returning capital to shareholders, for example, right? Higher dividends or stock buybacks. So we'll see what's going to happen there. But as a result of this slight shift in focus from the low PBR to the higher PBR stock, what you've seen in the first 6 trading days of the year was actually a higher appreciation of the high PBR stocks compared to what we saw last year, which was an appreciation of the lower PBR stocks. I think these themes will be with us for a while. And then next week, Monday, Tuesday, we also have the Bank of Japan monetary policy meeting. I think if you followed the yen since the beginning of the year, what is reflected in the exchange rate, the yen has become weaker again. We crossed 146 today. So the realization that the numbers are starting to get a bit weaker, that anybody who thought initially maybe the Bank of Japan will do something even in December, they had pushed it to January, and there's enough of the analysts, economists that we follow who don't think anything will happen during the first half. Maybe the investors' proverbial can gets kicked down the road and will simply get these swings somewhere between 140, 150 till the Bank of Japan really comes out and once changes their bias, and then secondly then eliminates the negative interest rate policy or NIRP. Again, most of the people we follow think it's going to happen in the second half of the year, or maybe the bias change in June after the wage negotiations are over and we have at least a preliminary number. And then that would need to translate into price increases in especially the service sector where we haven't seen it in 23. And so that by October, you could do away with the NIRP. But again, it's very hard to read the tea leaves there. But I think a consensus is developing in some shape or form that next week, not much will change, maybe some slight wording change in the Bank of Japan. So we shall see. When we come back next Tuesday at 5 o'clock, then actually we'd be in a position to discuss it as well. By that point, we should have the outlook report of the Bank of Japan in our hands, I think. That's it for today. We'll see how the interest is for this. We'll continue doing this for a while. I think people will get either used to the 5 p.m. Tuesday slot, which at least covers Europe and Asia, or they refer to the recording that we'll put out afterwards. So long, and hope to see you soon again. Bye-bye.